Somebody had to say something. Might as well be me. Go ahead, hate me. Welcome to a new generation. On that 2015 segregation. No more hiding in the clan with the fan, cause the media gon' see that the division of the nation. Real talk, I'ma spit it, let these words walk. You won't catch a white body outline chalk. Just another black body on the ground when the killers come around. Blue suits, grab the handcuffs. When the things bump back, and the people on the scene hear the scream.
So we use phrases like, well, what do you people want anyway? And the quote, you people, is part of a conditioned response
what he said.
And so that kind of initial, subconscious, automatic, not really requiring any thought, if it's applied to people of color, just gets us going in the wrong direction.
So let me just begin by introducing our guest presenter today. Don Stevens is a good friend of mine, and we've been friends for 18, 19 years. Don was actually on the call committee of La Casa de Cristo Lutheran Church when I was interviewed to be the pastor for men's ministry at La Casa in Scottsdale, Arizona. And I hope he gave me an affirmative vote, but that's yet to be seen. He questions my degree from Yale as whether or not it's earned or a mail order. We're still in debate about that, even though I've shown him my diploma. But Don is a dear, dear friend of my family and dear friend of mine. And I look forward to the insights that he will share with us regarding chapter 2, which deals with white supremacy from D'Angelo's book, White Fragility. So after reading the book, do you think that, and this is a pretty direct question, Don, do you think that you are racist?
If you had asked me that question before I looked at the book, I would have said no. I grew up in central Massachusetts, in a small town. The Protestants were the minority, Roman Catholics were the majority. And in central Massachusetts, at least not in the larger cities, there weren't any black people. After reading the book, I realized that I had never thought about it. I took it for granted that because I wasn't doing it, I didn't interact with any black people. I didn't have any negative feelings about black people. I thought it may have existed somewhere, but not in my town, not in my family, and not something that controlled me. So I think the way D'Angelo defines racism is much broader. She seems to want to assure the reader that she's really not talking about individual acts of racism. She's talking about a larger system in which the white majority, we currently make up like 75 or 78% of the population, controls everything. And that minorities, so blacks make up about 9 or 10%, and that the white majority determines a couple of things. Some of it not so important. But as I have both read the book and I have, since Pastor Kenneth asked me to participate, I've been doing a lot of research. And the more I looked, the more I realized that I hadn't seen it because I didn't think it applied to me. And I think many of us, we live in a world that may or may not involve interaction with people of color. And so we don't really know whether we're a racist. I would answer the question now, no, I am not a racist. But I think D'Angelo's main point or takeaway would be that, okay, do you think that racism exists in the United States? And my gut reaction before reading the book would have been, yes, probably in pockets, probably the South, maybe the East Coast somewhere, or in large cities where poverty is a big issue. So I think the issue for us is whether or not I ever looked. Did I just take it for granted that I was not? Because I'm white, I don't know anybody, I didn't talk to anybody, I haven't said bad words, my friends didn't say bad words, so I get a free pass. and I realized that it was something more. Part of it, I think, is because this is being sponsored by La Casa, I found a great quote, and it is that it has been said that religion is okay as long as it does not interfere with your life. And I never viewed going to church as an interference in my life. And I'm pretty sure that's because I didn't take the lessons to heart. And in the Matthew chapter 25, verse 40, Jesus says, whatever you do to the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did to me. And that just gets to my heart, because I'm not isolated from the rest of the world, and that I probably need to decide what I am going to do. And I think that's where the issue of racism, both personal, but more broadly in terms of the book, it is racism exists in the United States. And secondly, that we react somewhat defensively, hopefully with some intellectual honesty, to examine it for the first time. And sometimes when you look, you say you might think inadvertently, I have these feelings. And I think that the Holy Spirit is an amazing concept, an amazing person, because I was struggling with this issue. How do we discuss this intelligently? And just a couple of days ago, there was an article in the media that a government official had been asked to prevent federal agencies from spending millions of taxpayer dollars on training sessions that suggested that all white people contribute to racism, and that this white privilege or critical race theory was something that government officials should know something about. Well, that's a good example of white fragility. The language that is in this newspaper article, it could have been just taken out of D'Angelo's book, because somewhere, somehow, the people in government thought that when President Obama urged us to develop resources and train people about being not just racially sensitive. I mean, it's basically basic common decency. And if I disregard people, it's not really fair under any circumstances. And so I think that we can talk about this without being accusatory. And it seems to me that it was a very useful experience. I mean, Pastor Kenneth contacted me maybe a month ago, and I'm a lawyer by trade. And so if you ask me to do something, I'm going to do some research, and I'm going to find out what is going on. What things have I assumed that may or may not be true? And what the other piece of this I hope to be able to get a chance to mention is about a bias. And bias we think of as being bad, but it's really, there's a subconscious bias that says if I see, the classic example is a white lady is walking down the street and a black person a black male is approaching her, there's kind of an instinctive grab your purse kind of reaction. If I say that I'm actually from New Jersey, you probably have some idea. If I say I like the Boston Red Sox and, you know, the Diamondbacks are your favorite team, you form some opinions about me. They're not racial, they're just a bias. And sometimes because they're unconscious, we could be doing things inadvertently. So we use phrases like, well, what do you people want anyway? And the quote, you people, is part of a conditioned response that there are people like me and people not like me. And the not like me's fall into two categories. One category is, well, you seem okay, and I wouldn't mind getting to know you. And the not like me's are, no, I don't like you now. I will never like you. I don't even want to talk to you. And so that kind of initial, subconscious, automatic, not really requiring any thought, if it's applied to people of color, just gets us going in the wrong direction. Typical.
So before I do a follow-up question, before I do a follow-up, see, this is the challenge of having an attorney.
No, Steve, no, wait.
Presenter. You can't do that. Unless I'm cross-examining, I don't get a word in. But
Don, therein is the point.
Before I do a follow-up question, Don, I want to tell those who are in our audience, if you have a question, type it in our chat, and I'll try and offer it up to Don. But so, are you saying that the idea of fragility was real for you?
Yes, and for this reason. Not that I was afraid to talk about it, but I didn't like the idea that I might be racist and not know about it. Just like if I offend someone, the fact that I didn't intend to offend them doesn't change the offense. So I can, in legal terms, I can be negligent. In other words, I didn't intend, if I pull out a gun and kill somebody, that is an intentional act. If I am firing off a weapon into the air, I'm not intending to kill anybody. The bullet comes down and hits the young girl in her backyard on a holiday. So there's a disconnect there. And so, yeah, I think that's where we have to be a little bit more careful.
So do you agree with the author's suggestion that racism is not an individual character trait, but racism is about power used by the whites who have legal authority and control?
Not exactly. And that may be because of my training. She paints a much broader picture of a unified or collaborative agreement, spoken or unspoken, between white people that, hey, we got to stick together, and these minorities, they came here from someplace else, or they don't deserve it, or hey, they want stuff. Why don't they just work for it like we did? And I grew up poor in central Massachusetts. My dad didn't make very much money. He was in radio. I graduated from high school. I joined the Air Force out of high school because of the Vietnam War. And I worked. I went to Vietnam. I came back. I met a local girl. I got married and did college on the GI Bill. I didn't feel like that was white entitlement. Looking back, I thought, hey, I qualified for it, so I get it. It didn't occur to me that when I was admitted to the University of Arizona, I was admitted in place of an otherwise qualified black person. So that's what I'm saying. Part of this is an awareness, becoming aware that I am not alone. And so, how we deal with that is part of why we're doing this.
Yeah, and that speaks to the individualism that she addresses in chapter 1, the whole concept that you can really pull yourself up by the bootstraps, and all you have to do is work hard and you can fulfill the American dream. So do you agree with the suggestion then that recently there was this discussion in the media that everyone has the same opportunity to control and define the outcome of their lives, regardless of the barriers that they may encounter?
Absolutely
and do you think
not.
That's a fair statement to make?
No, it's not. No, it's not. And that is but on the other hand, if you think about the media stories that typically football players or athletes of some kind, when they are successful, they thank their mom and they say, "Thank you, Mom, because you were there for me. You were a rock. You kept me on the on the straight and narrow." And for every one of those people, there are tens of thousands of people right now who are suffering, who are losing their house, they're losing, they don't have those kinds of resources. And the idea that's why it's a kind of a bias, this individualism. Individualism allows me to protect myself. Individualism allows me to distance myself from racist bigots and those people and say, that's not my kind. I don't approve of that. I don't sponsor that. And so this myth that anybody can be anything they want to is statistically possible the same way you buy a lottery ticket. We buy lottery tickets with 1 in 6,200 million bazillion chances of winning. And yet
I feel lucky.
I'm sorry?
I feel lucky.
There you go. So no, I don't think that individualism, I think individualism is used as a reason for me not to engage. Because I think if my bias is that this is a country of equality, and that when we started talking about the Constitution or the Bill of Rights or the Declaration of Independence, we used lofty terms, and that we have not fully accomplished that.
I read a quote this morning by Harry Belafonte. As many of you may know, Harry Belafonte is from my home country of Jamaica. He sings that famous song, Day-O, daylight come and me want to go home. And he says, young people these days want to keep it real. And keeping it real means, in fact, understanding that white supremacy, you thought you could push back, permeates every nook and cranny of this nation so deeply that you ought to wake up and recognize how deep it is. How did you react to the author's idea of white supremacy in chapter 2?
Again, so as I approach this analytically, and you look at her definition, she's using white supremacy as a fact. There are 75, however many millions of Americans there are, 75% of us are white. What is the natural result of that? That we adopt things that we think are good for everybody, but may or may not take into account minorities. And so white supremacy, the way she presents it, is not individual guys in white pointy hats. And actually, an interesting side note is the second iteration of the KKK thought they were sent by God. They wore white because it was purity, and they burned the cross because it was the cross that Jesus died on. So you can see how these ideas create a bias, create what's called confirmation bias. I see stuff, it is consistent with what I believe, and therefore, it goes on. And so, for instance, Dalai Lama had a somewhat different quote: whether one is rich or poor, educated or illiterate, religious or non-believing, man or woman, black or white or brown, we are all the same. Physically, emotionally, and mentally, we are all equal. We all share basic needs for food, shelter, safety, and love. We all aspire to happiness and we shun suffering. Each of us has hopes, worries, fears, and dreams. Each of us wants the best for our family and loved ones. We all experience pain when we suffer loss and joy when we achieve what we seek. On this fundamental level, religion, ethnicity, culture, and language make no difference. And that was I used to do a lot of reading of quotes because it gave me a different perspective on life than I had my own myself. And so, yeah, you can take it out of context, but I think white supremacy, in the sense of some master secret society in which we get together in conventions and we decide how can we make the lives of Black people as miserable as possible. And frankly, I don't know if it's as directed to Blacks anymore as to immigrants, because the immigrants who came here illegally are put into a different category. And maybe we instinctively feel that's not right. You came here illegally, you didn't play by the rules, so we owe you nothing. And I think that white supremacy, her idea that because there are more rich white people than people of color, and that means that we're all racist. I think that's the problem with it's a type of argument that says we just extend it out into the universe and it must be true. So is there white supremacy? Yes, in the statistical numbers, and I think it shows itself up, not so much, in my opinion, and maybe I'm just fooling myself, but we do what we think is best for everyone, but we don't take into account the unintended consequence. Can I give you two short examples? One is, and the courts are studying this now, of institutional racism, where, for instance, there were mandatory sentences, and the judge had to follow the mandatory sentence and apply it equally to everybody. So on its face, it looks like it's fair. But if you look at the statistics, Black men and women were more likely to get more serious prison time. They were less likely to be released on parole. They were less likely, or they're more likely to be supervised on parole. Bail. The Constitution just says there's no excessive bail. Well, what is excessive? And you see it all the time in the news. Well, they set bail at $1 million. Well, for a poor person, particularly a person of color, setting bail at even $5,000 means they're going to stay in jail for however the 8 or 10 or 12 months it's going to take to get this route. So there is institutional, unintended things that we do that look objective, and the judge, quite frankly, looks at it and says, I'm following the rules. I'm following what you told me to do. And objectively, unfortunately, it affects people of color more than white people.
Okay, that's a great segue to a question that came through in the chat. And it says, a lot of laws are facially neutral, but have disparate impact upon people of different races.
Amen.
Like the crack cocaine laws, stop and frisk laws. But to show that these laws violate equal protection, to show that these laws violate equal protection, one has to show discriminatory intent as well as disparate impact. Should we move away from the intent requirement, especially if we're thinking about racism as a structure, as structural rather? Because part of the point is that even if individuals are not consciously motivated by race, there can still be systemic racism. Why isn't it enough to see that there is enormous disparity impact and that this results in the unequal protection under the law?
Okay. That is a really good question, and it's got multiple parts. But the simple answer is if there is a category of crimes, murder, for instance, that requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt of intent. Intent can be internal. I intend to do this and I'm going to do this. Or external, I'm going to act on it. And I think that imposing a system that only looks at the mental state and says, you can have a lawsuit just by a pattern of behavior. That still exists in my view under civil rights. So that you can show a pattern. You don't have to show that I hated that person. But in the prison system, for instance, if I routinely deny medical care, needed medical care to persons of color while providing full medical care to white people, I don't need to show their intent. Their intent can be proven by other things. It may be that, on the other hand, what are we trying to prevent? And I don't think we have enough time to go through the police part. But why, if you got into intent, it would be personal. It would be to that person saying, no, I didn't have the intent. So then what standard do you use to say whether or not what you did was negligent or intentional? So I believe the rule generally says that officers are supposed to follow the law. But it doesn't always, it frequently doesn't look that way. And the other piece is that sometimes the conduct of the officer is something we would disagree with, but when you go to a jury, they accept the officer's sworn testimony. I didn't intend, I didn't know, whatever. And they believe that, even though it makes absolutely no sense. And I've had a couple of court cases in which the officer did things that I didn't think were appropriate. And the jury, in one case, afterwards, found in favor of my client, the police officer, and came out and told me, they looked around and they said, Mr. Stevens, you tell your officer that we really didn't like what he did to that guy. But that guy was drunk and he shouldn't have said something or thrown a shoe or whatever it was. So I think I can't give a good answer to the question. And the problem, the burden of proof, even showing a pattern, is very difficult for an average person. So a person who was discriminated against, excessive force, whatever it is, you'd have to go through everything that they did, and they get a pass if this is their first time. They killed somebody. Those people who kneeled on Floyd, you didn't have to have a history to see that was wrong. There's reckless disregard. I think the piece that's missing here is that somebody can be guilty of something for reckless disregard. That means you knew or should have known. That's the law standard. Knew or should have known. So I don't think that's
there's a comment in the chat, and then we only have about 8 more minutes, and I'll just let people come in and ask their own questions. I feel the author is also highlighting that the systems upon which this country is founded, the Constitution, the Electoral College, and the penal system, all were written by white folks, and indeed, in some cases, deliberate to ignore the needs and the lives of people of color in this nation. We, as the modern era, have the opportunity and responsibility to change those systemic racist acts. Yes, your mandatory minimums and cash bail example is great. So I want to give anyone who wants to unmute and ask a direct question or make a comment to do that, but keep in mind we only have about 7 more minutes for this recording. So if you would just chime in, give us your name, and ask Don whatever questions or make whatever comments if you're able to do that at this time.
And I'll promise to give you shorter answers.
Okay.
So the pending question was, not, you don't have to read the whole thing, but I wanted at the beginning, what was the why part?
I'm trying to unmute people.
Oh, sorry.
I don't know if I'm having any luck.
So the system, you're right. I would agree with you that the system of laws for mandatory sentencing was directed at criminals and in the general category, criminals being persons of color. And yes, that's racist. And on the other hand, the white people who elect those folks, those electors, they want protection. They want peace. That's why they don't like riots. And as we know from the 60s and the civil rights movement, sometimes you have to yell loud enough for somebody to pay attention to you.
Okay, Dr. Mahoney is unmuted and Chelsea is unmuted. So if either of you want to comment, please do so at this time.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Don. Thank you for your presentation. It's very interesting. I can relate to it, even though I would, from an educator's perspective, I see some of the same things as we look at what happens to the youth that we work with, who we work with, and the consequences of their behavior. But I also, look at racism. As I went through this book, I kept trying to figure out, okay, what can I use to just really, put this into perspective for me very clearly. And I looked at it as racism is a double-edged sword, as every sword has two edges. One edge is denial, and the other edge is, a good word for it. It's denial and intent. Because as an educator, I taught biology, and I used to tell my students, I've taught in both urban and suburban communities, and I used to tell my students when they would ask questions, I would say to them, every one of you in this class is important to me. I see you have different shades on the outside, but if I were to cut each of you, everybody's blood is red. And they would pause, the children, they would pause for a minute and really think about that. And so I would say to them, the racism is not, it's not in your blood, as they say, because everybody's blood is red. The racism is in your thought. It's in your intent. It is in your denial of something that some other person has an equal right to under the law. And so, I think this racial issue will continue. And until there are more people like me and others who really see the negative outcome of implied and institutionalized racism or the unequal application of the law, until we have enough people with our conviction that says, wait a minute, no. The act is the act. If every person of color or someone else, if everybody from every race committed the same act, one would expect that they would all have the same consequence.
Well, and that would be equally. So they showed a bunch of clips for the march with Dr. King and John Lewis, and so they played after he died, they played the shot where he was marching peacefully and the police officers come up with dogs and beat him. And I would hope that universally we would all say that's a bad thing. And I think one point of the book I don't want to lose is that we have to do something. We have to speak up. And secondly, we can't give ourselves excuses, a free pass by saying, well, it's not me, it's not my friends. And I think collectively we need to do that. And so I need 30 seconds, Katie, at some point.
Okay, we have like 2.5 minutes. So unless someone else has a question, go.
No, I don't want to cut you off. I want to close with two Bible quotes that were meaningful to me during this study. Okay. Anybody? And I want to thank you for listening. I have had a knot in my stomach. I'm a trial lawyer. I go to trial. And so when I do a closing argument, I work on it a long time. I take it personally. Those are my clients. And so I approached this with an open mind, and I appreciate your patience and accommodations.
Thank you, Don. We have about a minute and a half left.
All right. So Isaiah 1, chapter 17, to me was a going forward guidance. Learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, and plead the widow's cause. And then from Micah 6:8, he has told you, O man, what is good. What does the Lord require of you but to act justly, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? And with that, I think those are the guides that need to inspire, encourage, energize, and empower, and make us courageous about our sphere of influence, people who know us, who look up to us, teachers, whoever. And we have to live up to that. And I think we owe it to the least of these, whoever they are.
Well, thank you for joining us in chapter 2 of white supremacy, of white fragility. Chapter 2 was focusing on white supremacy. We hope that you'll join us again next week when we look at chapter 3, racism after the civil rights movement, with Professor Jordan Liz from San Jose State University. Again, thank you for joining us this week. Thank you, Don, for being our co-presenter. Thank you, all of those who are online with us, and we look forward to seeing you again next week.
But that don't affect me, so I'm chilling. You can find me in a sweet spot with some hashtag activists. Do we really gotta act on this? Just some undercover pacifist. Man, I'm praying I don't pass no fist. They gon' treat me like a citizen. That fact, you gon' speak the shit. That our brothers still struggling. Niggas sitting on privilege. They gon' treat me like a citizen. That fact, you gon' speak the shit. That our brothers still struggling. We living in a whitewashed nation where the government can hinder motivation. Take away their support system, let them play victim to themselves and their own generation. Mandatory that the cops ain't intelligent. IQ too high, get to stepping quick. What you really think it mean when they building whole teams? Military on the move in the midst of it.